So we're going to do an introduction to Mobisec. I'm Jason Gillam. Oops, hang on, I just went ahead there. Jason Gillam. I'm a senior security consultant with Secure Ideas, and I have a lot of experience, particularly in development and architecture, and then I moved into security several years ago, and I won't say I haven't looked back since. I've never gone back to a pure development type of job since then, but I've still been using my development skills for mostly for writing testing tools for penetration testing. So favorite parts of my job. I love hacking, and I'd like to define that, qualify that as a problem-solving type of characteristic. It's not all about breaking into things. That is fun, though, as long as you do it with permission. And I enjoy talking about that sort of thing as well, which is why I'm here today. I'm also an open source contributor, in addition to Mobisec, which we're talking about. I'm also involved in the Samurai web testing framework and a project called Laudanum, which is another tool that we use. And also I'm the author of a few Burp extensions, including Burp CO2 is probably the most well-known one. Okay. So it looks like some people can't, or at least one person can't hear me right now. All right, and I guess when I'm not busy doing the hacking thing, in addition to looking after my family, I have a few hobbies. I do some running, mostly to offset my home brewing, because there's a little bit of drinking that goes on with that, and then I'm also I do a little bit of music with the piano, and I'm trying to learn the bass, but I never seem to have enough time to make much progress with that. So, all right. So, why do we want to do mobile assessments? Why is it important to take a look at mobile applications? So let's start off with that question. Basically, it seems pretty straightforward. We put a lot of stuff on phones these days and on tablets. And that stuff tends to be important to us. So first of all, who doesn't have a smartphone? The latest statistics I was able to find show that roughly 2/3 of American adults in the United States all have a smartphone at this point in time. I actually thought the number would be even a little bit higher than that, but this is what we have for the stats. And worldwide, we're close to 2 billion smartphones in use at this present time. So that's a very large number of devices out there. And when you consider that all of these devices have a significant amount of processing power, like just compare what you can do on the latest iPhone or Android device compared to a PC. Less than 10 years ago even, and you can run your 3D games on there. You can do quite a bit of processing on there. There's a significant amount of space on these devices. I don't know what the average is right now, but you see it's not uncommon to see at least 16 gigs of space on smartphone devices these days. As a sort of the baseline, and it just goes up from there. So the types of things that we find on them are well, just about everything. A lot of people basically live off their smartphone, and in some cases there are people who have smartphones who don't even have PCs or laptops at this point. I don't have the stats on that, but it's also kind of an interesting one to look at. But a large percentage of, we're talking about more than half the people who have smartphones are using them for online banking at some point. They are using them for health care type of information, looking up information about health care. And the last number I have on here, 67%. I thought this was pretty interesting. Of smartphone owners will check for messages and alerts and calls and so on and so forth, even when their phone is not making any noises or vibrating. It's just a habit. So the smartphone has become such an integral part of our lives that a lot of us are addicted, and I'm guilty of this myself, of just constantly checking it, even though it's there's really no alert on there or anything. We're afraid we might miss something. It's our connection to the information highway, right? So it's pretty important, and the type of information that we put on it is equally important. So we have potentially banking type of information, financials. Most people have email on there of some type as well, and as you know, just about every other account you have can be reset through your email, so a compromised email account's a bad thing. And yeah, there's just all types of information on there. It's very valuable. By the way, if anyone has questions, I've muted all the lines, so please go into the chat on GoToTraining and type your question in there. I'll keep an eye on it. So considering all of this information and all the various different apps out there, there's I don't know how many hundreds of thousands now, we're not making the same types of mistakes as we did in the past. That's unfortunately not true. We are making a lot of the same mistakes we have been. We still have this situation where a lot of the apps out there in the app stores are they're built by amateurs, and that's not a bad thing. I think that it's good that so many people have jumped on there and gotten involved in technology and basically come up with these ideas and created them in the form of an app. But a lot of them simply don't have the experience or background to understand the security implications of what they're doing. So we end up with a lot of apps that just they make a lot of assumptions. Your input validation is probably one of the biggest ones there. Where they don't understand the concept of sanitizing your input before you use it, and that's the type of thing that we run into, where we were aware of this problem. Those of us who've been in the field for a while saw the same types of issues show up in web applications when they were first became the big thing, and now the same types of issues are showing up in mobile apps as well. So. All right, so let me talk a little bit about Mobisec, the virtual machine environment itself. And so what this is, it's a environment similar to the Samurai web testing framework or Backtrack or Kali. It's basically a Linux environment that already has tools and frameworks pre-installed for you for doing mobile pen testing. So that's basically it in a nutshell. It was a DARPA Cyber Fast Track project. I guess it's still considered that, which is it's been a great thing for us. We really owe a lot to the Cyber Fast Track program, because that's basically what lets us busy consultants who we rely on billable work week to week. It's programs like this that allow us to take a break from that and actually still get paid and actually produce something like Mobisec with our expertise, which has been fantastic. It's a open source project. First came out in 2012. The latest release is 2.0, came out just earlier this year. So that's the one that I'm going to be going over right now. So the Mobisec 2.x build, it's actually run as a virtual machine environment, and this is a little bit different than the Mobisec when it first came out. When it first came out, we did a live environment, so where you you would put it on a CD or USB and boot it up directly off of that. But what we found is that it's been used so much more frequently as a virtual machine that it just made sense to go in that direction instead. Another big change is that we've moved from a 32-bit VM to a 64, and this was a pretty big decision. Part of the reason we did that is because some of the mobile tools, particularly in the Android space, are deprecating support for 32-bit. So we wanted to go ahead and move to 64 before we're pushed off of 64-bit processing. The minimum amount of memory you're going to need if you're running this is 1 gig. If you're 1 gig of RAM. If you're doing if you're using the emulator, the Android emulator inside of Mobisec, you'll probably need a little bit more than that, especially if you're using it a lot. So 1.5, maybe even 2, would be a good idea. Now, one thing that I'll point out at this point as well is that most of what we look at inside of Mobisec is Android, and that's simply because of licensing. It's just a whole lot easier to work on the Android platform, especially since we're also using this a lot for teaching how to do mobile pen tests. That doesn't mean that you can't use it for your other platforms, though. It still works for the other platforms. Most of the tools that we make use of work across various different mobile platforms. So I just want to at least put that out there, that although the focus is going to be on Android, that doesn't mean that the skills aren't transferable to skills and tools aren't transferable to other platforms. It just comes down to licensing more than anything else. Downloads available on SourceForge. So 2.0.2 is the latest version right now. It was put there I think a couple weeks ago. So one other thing I want to point out as well is if you're doing any mobile pen testing on really old platforms, there are some of the older 32-bit applications were dropped out of Mobisec in 2.0. So if you're using those, what you want to do is you want to get whatever the latest 1.x version of Mobisec is, and then you'll still have access to those tools. All right. So one other thing I want to point out is there's a lot of little gotchas here, and that's part of the reason why I'm putting this together. So if you're running Mobisec, remember it is a 64-bit VM. There's a good chance that you have not run any other 64-bit VMs on your VM platform. At least that's what I've noticed in classes, that several people have not. So what's going to happen is when you go to start that up, VMware or VirtualBox will complain that that you don't have 64-bit enabled, 64-bit virtualization enabled on your motherboard. So it's a firmware setting in the BIOS. You basically just have to reboot, get into the BIOS, and make the change. I'm not going to put the steps for each one on here because every platform is different. So that's something that you can look up. Okay, device support. So we have this platform for testing, and by the way, I am going to show you Mobisec in just a couple of minutes here, and then we can start actually. A lot of this will make a little bit more sense if you haven't seen it before. So we can support several different options for if we have an application, where do we put the application and how do we test it? The first one is the Android Virtual Device, or AVD, and that's the standard Android emulator. There is a similar type of function on iOS as well, but you would need to actually run that on a Mac. So the AVD is available inside of Mobisec, and we already have a virtual device configured in there for you. It is very slow. It's naturally very slow being an emulator. It's even slower being an emulator running inside of a virtual machine where it can't take advantage of any hardware acceleration at all. So that's just something to keep in mind. The other option, the second option that we use, is Android x86. We don't make this VM available with Mobisec because it's not actually part of Mobisec, but we do make one available whenever we teach a full class on Mobisec. So that's basically it's Android running on top of an x86 architecture, and it's, I guess it's called, I don't know if it's a simulator or an emulator at that point, but it's much faster than the standard Android emulator to do it this way. So that's another good option. You can actually download, it's open source. You can download the Android x86 project and install that onto a VM fairly easily. You can get an ISO and just run an install. It is a few versions behind the official Android releases, but it's not so far behind that it becomes a real issue unless you have to test the latest. And then your third option, of course, is to run a physical device. You can connect a physical device on Mobisec. The tricky part is Mobisec is actually running in Ubuntu, and you will need to find and install the driver for that device. So each one's different, so we don't go through that here, and we actually, when we teach a class, we also don't do it there. But what I would recommend is if you are going to be testing a particular physical device, go ahead and find the driver install and get it configured. And once it's there, do a snapshot of your virtual machine, and you probably won't have to worry about reinstalling that at any point. For a while anyway. So, okay, VMware versus VirtualBox. We usually teach our class on VMware. That's also what we test Mobisec on, primarily is VMware. We have done some testing on VirtualBox and have been able to get it to work. There's been a little bit of device finagling in order to make it actually work, but I've seen it working fairly well. We have had some issues getting the Android x86 to actually run on VirtualBox, and I'm not sure what that is at this point in time. So I haven't had the time to sit down and hash that out yet. So our recommendation is, if you can, go with VMware. Any of the solutions with it. You can use Player Workstation if you have the Enterprise VMware. That should work. We haven't tested that. We mostly just test on the free stuff. And then if you're on a Mac, it's going to be VMware Fusion most likely. Okay, so question in the chat is, how about using Mobisec with Xen or HVM or PV? That's a good question. I think that's something that we can definitely play around with. I personally haven't tried it out, and I don't know of anyone who has, so I don't know whether or not it would work on those solutions. So that's a good question, though. If you do happen to give it a shot, and please let me know if it works. It's always good to know. Okay, so let me just do a walkthrough of the virtual machine environment itself, and we'll see if we'll move on from there afterwards. So, oh, hang on. We need this one here. I have both VMs up here. Okay, so Mobisec, it's running on top of Ubuntu. Like I said, really there's not a whole lot on the desktop that's exciting. There is a word list folder on there. Most of the tools are under Applications. There's a Mobisec 2.0 folder item in there with a folder structure. And for those of you who've used Kali or Samurai or Backtrack before, this approach should seem pretty familiar to you. We have the each of the types of tools that we use in various different mobile assessment activities. They're all divided into, they're organized into these folders. So we have development tools, and that's actually under development tools. That's where you're going to find the emulators and simulators in there. See, if we look in here, we have there's our Android virtual device over here. We do have actually some, in several places in here you'll find items that refer to either BlackBerry or Windows or iOS. Those are going to primarily just be links out to where you can either get more information or download the tools. Okay, so we also have a section here for forensics and mobile infrastructure. Penetration testing is probably the biggest one that we look at. And we've divided everything in there into the 4 categories that represent our methodology, our standard methodology for both web pen testing as well as mobile pen testing. So that's in there. And then we have reverse engineering. That's a big part of mobile pen tests. Sometimes we'll have a bundled app, but we don't have a source code. And being able to get down to the source code can really help us figure out, well, first of all, we can find information in there, such as credentials for connecting to a database or a service. And then the other aspect is the just understanding what the code is doing really helps in some places. So another question is, when we test mobile apps, should we focus on testing server-side too and find vulns using like NIC2, etc.? Absolutely. In fact, NIC2 is installed on Mobisec. So that's one of the first things I mention when we teach the 2-day class on Mobisec is that if you are already very familiar with web application pen testing, then you're probably at least halfway there for mobile pen testing, because a lot of the vulnerabilities we find actually are on the server side, typically in web services. That's where we're going to find them. So it's a great question. We also have some wireless analyzer tools in there as well. So that's basically it for the menu. Also, though, if you open a console, and I mentioned, whoops, hang on, this is messing up my screen here. I don't know why the window got so big there. There we go. So if I type NIC2, for example, it should just start running there. So there's many of the tools that are in the menu. I think we're maybe 3/4 of the way there. We don't have all of them. And if you find any tool that isn't in the path that probably should be, let us know. These are the types of things we're trying to fix. We are rolling out patches for Mobisec probably about once a quarter, or sometimes twice in a quarter. So we're trying to keep tools up to date, keep everything fresh, keep it all working. And also making sure that if we have little bugs in there, where like such as something not in the path that should be, that we get that addressed as well. So anyway, that's how we get to that. Okay, go back to my presentation. So that's it for just a quick walkthrough of the environment itself. Now, the next little bit I wanted to go over is it pertains to our class, but everything that you need to do this is actually on the Mobisec environment already. So this is something that you can also do just to set up a little test application to play around with, see if you can find some of the flaws in there. and especially if you already have some experience with web app pen testing, you kind of get an idea of how it all works. And you don't need to go to class to get this much done. So this will kind of kickstart you and get you going on the right path. So basically, what we do is we have this lab application, and granted, it is a little bit of an old one. It's the Security Compass Exploit Me mobile, and the Android version. There is an iOS version as well of this application. It's basically a banking application that has an Android an Android app front end. So it's basically bring that up on your emulator or your device, and then you can log in with it. And there is a Python backend, and the Python backend is actually available on Mobisec as well, so you can spin that up and get that going. That's all an open source project. I actually rebuilt it recently. It still doesn't look any prettier than it did before. It didn't look. It looks pretty ugly actually for an app, but that's really not that important right now. It's just the functionality. But we updated it to APK 19 or KitKat, and that way it's more in line with modern applications that are out there, at least compiled on the same type of code base. It's also been signed as well, so it has a self-signed cert. So that's basically it for the target application itself. And I just noticed another question come in, but I'll address that in just a second. I want to get through the next couple of slides, and then I'll go over to the questions and then back to the demonstration. So basically for the lab setup, I'll just run through this quickly and then I'll show it to you. It'll make more sense when I show it. So we want to make sure first and foremost that our device or our emulator and Mobisec are both on the same network. What I usually do for class purposes is I'll have them on a host-only network. That's not necessarily going to work if you're testing a live application that needs to connect to the internet. In our case, it doesn't for the Mobisec Lab environment, so we just keep a host-only. That way we don't have to worry about any external interference or accidentally hacking somebody else's site or anything like that. So then we want to start up the target service, so we actually have a service running. And then what we'll do is we need to make sure that the Android device can see Mobisec and that Mobisec can see the Android device. So we'll go through a little bit of back and forth there, and then we'll install the lab application. So before I go in and demonstrate this, I just want to address the question that's come up in the chat. So regarding things like input validation, cross-site scripting, code injection, so on and so forth, how do we actually test for all of that inside of mobile applications? And this is followed up with the question, do we still do fuzzing of parameters? And the answer to that is typically what I will do is go through the mapping part, and unfortunately I won't have time today to demonstrate the entire process. It takes several hours, but we'll map out the application and capture all of that traffic within a proxy. So it's the same type of process that you do with web application pen testing, except that instead of pointing your browser through a proxy, you're going to point your mobile app through the browser or through the proxy, and then so you'll capture all of that traffic, and then once you've captured that, you're pretty much working mostly inside your proxy tool at that point in time. So you're still going to be able to, you're talking to service, usually it's HTTP, JSON or SOAP-based services, and you will basically generate your payloads the same way you would with a web application backend. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so the lab setup. So let me just step through this. This is a something that you'll need to do if you're going to use the labs within Mobisec at all, whether it be experimenting on your own or coming to a full 2-day Mobisec class. So let's see here. So we have these two environments. I have the Mobisec environment, which I just showed you a few minutes ago, and then I have the Android x86 environment. And this is the vanilla Android x86. I haven't done anything to it. Haven't installed anything special on it. If you install off the Android x86 ISO, you should get the same thing. So basically what we'll need to do is first thing we want to do is make sure that these two VMs can actually talk to each other. So to do that, we'll use our standard Unix tools. And I won't maximize the whole window there because I want to make sure that we can flip back and forth easy. Hopefully it's not too small for you. So I'll just type using standard ifconfig, standard Unix tools. We have the IP address of the Mobisec VM is, in my case, 172.16.179.146. That's a host-only network, so that's internal. So we have that, and it's a good idea to write that down. What you'll find is, especially if you're working off a single screen, that flipping back and forth between the x86 VM and the Mobisec VM is a bit of a nuisance, and you'll end up like screens, especially inside of the x86 environment. When you leave the environment, it goes back to the home screen on its own sometimes, and that's it can be a bit frustrating if you haven't written this down. So. Okay, so we've written that down. So now we need to find the IP address of the x86 environment. Now there's, depending on if you're using a device, you'll probably go through finding this a different way. What I've done here, and this is just to facilitate this in a classroom environment because I didn't want to have to go into configuration options that involved going to the command line on the Android x86 environment. So what I've done is on Mobisec, I have an ip.php file running on a local Apache instance that's already there. We have an Apache instance because some of our targets use it. So if you go to the ip.php file on there, that'll return the basically the externally facing, within this network anyway, IP address of our Android environment. So I've done this from the Android VM, and it shows that my IP address here is 172.16.179.144, and so I'll write that down. Okay, so now I have the IP addresses of both environments. Next thing that I'll want to do, see as I exited the Android x86 environment, went back to the home screen, so I lost that information. So the next thing that we'll want to do is we'll want to be able to talk to that Android environment from Mobisec. So to do that, let me go ahead and make this just a little bit bigger here. To do that, we're going to use an Android command. The Android Debugging Bridge, ADB, is the main way that we communicate with Android devices or emulators or the Android x86 environment from within Mobisec or anywhere else. ADB is a standard Android software development kit set of tools. So what we'll do first, I'll just type ADB devices, and we'll see that it says list of devices attached, and it doesn't have a list. It's empty at this point in time. So what we'll want to do is ADB connect and the IP address of our device, which we just wrote down. So in my case, it's 172.16.179.144. And we're running on a default port on there, so And you'll see that it says connected to 172 in the IP address. So it says it's connected there on port 5555, which is the default port for Android devices. If it's the very first time that you've run this, I actually ran this previously while I was testing things out. It may also start up a daemon process for ADB. That's normal. Okay, so once it's connected, now if we do ADB devices, we should see our device listed there. Okay, so that's how we connect there. Now, getting the lab running, so let's say now that we have a connection, we want to get the lab environment running. What we'll do is we'll go under Development Tools, Emulators and Simulators, or you could just type up in the search here. If you just type lab server, you'll see it there. And we'll be running the HTTP version. I should mention the HTTPS version of that lab server is currently malfunctioning in the latest build. That's something we're working on. But we do have the HTTP version working just fine. Okay, so there's the lab, and it started, and it's serving HTTP on port 42080. Okay. All right, so oh, hang on. There's one more thing I want to do. So now we have our server running, so now we have to install our client. And the client is from the home directory. If you cd lab, you'll see that there are two files in there, Mobisec lab.apk and Mobisec lab config.apk. We'll need both of those. The config APK, that's a separate application that handles the configuration. It's a little bit of a hack that we put together specifically for the Android x86 environment because at this present time that Android x86 build does not have proxy configuration available within its user interface. You can still configure the proxy from the command line, but that's not something that we ever want to do in a class environment. So for the lab, we set it up a little bit easier by having this config app. So what we'll do to install these, it's again we're using ADB, and this time we're going to do ADB install Mobisec lab.apk, and that will take a few seconds. I'm still here. Okay, hang on a second. I know why it's taking a bit longer. So yeah, sometimes you'll get this prompt here from Google to regularly check device activity for security problems, etc., etc. We're on a local host network in this case, so it doesn't really matter if you accept or decline. So once I did that, it went ahead. It didn't take that long. And then we have the Mobisec Lab Config, .apk, and you see that it also prompted the same way. So we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so now both of these are on there. While I'm in this window, let me just show one more ADB command that's kind of handy. You may have heard that Android has a Linux environment underneath, or a Linux-like environment. If you just do ADB shell at this point, since we're only connected to one device, by the way, that's why all these ADB commands just go to whichever device we're connected to. Then you're inside of a shell, and you have it's a limited set of functions that are available in there, but you do have access to to basically a Linux-like shell. You can CD and cat files and move around the file system in there. You won't have access to everything because you're not a privileged user. But fortunately, on Android x86, it comes pre-installed with with SU. So basically, you become root. You just type SU, super user, and there you are. You're root. You have access to everything at that point. So let me exit out of there. Okay. So now that we have our application, our lab application installed, what we'll want to do is probably check the configuration on it. So if we go to our installed apps, we see there's the Mobisec Lab and there's the lab config. So we'll open the lab config first. And we'll see that, first of all, the host is set incorrectly. This is actually 10.0.2.2. If you're running this on an emulator, 10.0.2.2 is the host OS. And then, so what we'll do is we'll change this to 172.16.179. We want to point it to our Mobisec, so that's the 146. The ports are the same. At this point, I'm not going to set up the proxy yet. I'll do that in a moment. Okay. So, quick question here in the chat. Have a couple of old phones with Android sitting around. Do the devices need to be rooted, or is developer access the only requirement? Okay, so a rooted device is always more helpful, but we don't necessarily always have access to a rooted device. Let me rephrase that. It depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to emulate what an attacker would do if, let's say, they stole a device, what could they get to on that device? Then you wouldn't be, they wouldn't necessarily have root on that device. And although there are ways of doing it, it can be complicated to do so and also preserve the data on there. But yes, generally a rooted device is better. To run ADB, you do need developer mode. It doesn't require root access, but you will need to get root access if you want to be able to download all of the and get into all of the information inside of the application folders themselves, because they do set up permissions on those folders for each app. So. Okay. So we set up our configuration. Next thing that we'll do is we'll go into our lab folder itself and our lab application, and it says enter your bank credentials. There are a couple of test users. If you go on the security, it's the same as the default for Security Compass. So if you're looking at their demos and whatnot online, you're going to see them. So JDoe and password is one of them, and I'm hoping this works. It says set a new pin. This is something that I changed from the original as well, as I wanted to move to a pin system. Although it's not pretty, it's typical. Either pins or now we're seeing use your fingerprint in order to basically expedite your login the next time you use the application on your mobile device. You'll find that you don't have to retype long passwords very often anymore, which kind of makes you wonder. And this is something you always have to consider when you're doing a test is, well, where are the actual credentials being stored and how? Okay, so now we're inside and we have access to it. We can look at accounts. We can have statements. And so we're inside of that lab application and everything seems to be working. So this by itself is okay. We have an application running, but we still haven't got to a point where we are able to see our traffic on there. And so I will go through that quickly, and then that should be the end probably. All right, so let's go ahead and use Burp. I don't think this is the absolute latest version of Burp. It's probably a few weeks old. All right, so we have Burp up and running. We have our intercept turned off. That's kind of important. Otherwise, we won't be able to see what we're doing. Okay, so the first thing we need to realize is that inside of Burp, or if you're using Z-Attack proxy or some other proxy, hopefully it's just Burp or Zap for most of what you're doing. You're going to see that the interface is actually listening just locally, but we have our mobile app is actually running on from somewhere else. It's on a different virtual machine that has a different IP address, so it's not going to come in on the local host interface. So we'll want to add another interface, and it's going to be this 172.16.179.146. You can listen on all interfaces. That's an approach too, and especially if you're in a host-only network, it's no big deal to do that. Personally, I prefer not to do that. That's listening on all interfaces may have unexpected side effects at times. You start capturing traffic from somewhere you're not expecting. So I usually try to specify the specific interface that I want to capture traffic on. Okay, so now we have that set up. And our last step, of course, is we want to set up the proxy. Now, if you're running from either the emulator or from an actual device, then instead of using this lab config when you do your pen test, you'll be able to actually go into the network configuration screen under the normal setup app. And from there, you can set a web proxy to go through Mobisec or wherever you have your proxy set up. Okay, so our proxy host in this case is the same as where our application is running, just because both are running on Mobisec. And then we want to say that we're using the proxy, and the port that I specified was 8080, so I don't need to change that. Okay, so this should be set up now. So now if I go back to the application, looks like I'm prompted for a pin again. Since I want to capture everything though, I'm going to start back at the beginning. See the three little bars up here in the right hand corner? That lets you reset the application. It basically clears out the current user, so you can start over again. And I'm going to go jdo password done. And if you can see on the other window in the back on Mobisec, you can see that a request was actually seen by the proxy. So now I'm configuring my pin. Then we can look at accounts, statements. I just want to click on a couple things there so we have something to go off. Oops. Now let me switch back over to here, and we can see if in our proxy history each of those requests that I made, the login, it looks like that happened twice, and then the accounts and the statements that I went to. So. Okay. All right. Let me go back to my slides, and I'll finish up. So there's one more question that came through on the chat. Is the application getting installed in a rooted device itself a vulnerability? Well, if your goal is to just test an application, so somebody gives you an app, then manipulating it inside of your own rooted device, that's probably not really considered vulnerability. I can see where an enterprise might consider, if the ability for an app to run within a rooted device a bit of a problem. And in some cases, like financial apps, for example, I could see them being concerned about that, just because rooted devices with processes potentially running as root would have access to information from just about every other app running on there. So, so it is a more dangerous environment to run in, and I don't recommend anybody to root their devices that they use for their personal use, their email and their banking and so on and so forth. And if you do, just be very careful about what you install on there and where you get it from. But yeah, as far as a vulnerability in the app itself, it probably depends more on the app whether or not that's a concern and what the app can do. All right, but I will say as well that many of the apps that I've tested install just fine inside of a rooted device. So. All right, so that's a quick taste, bit of an overview, and also how to set up the lab environment that's inside of Mobisec, so you can play around with this on your own. If you do have any questions on what we've gone through, please let me know either in the chat here now or you can email me later. I'll put my information up at the end, so you can email me and ask me that way. The full class, so we also do a 2-day course on this, which is very much hands-on. We cover methodology in quite a bit of detail, and we go through full reverse engineering of an Android application. So how do you, given an APK, how do you get yourself down to source code and resources, and what can you do with that? We look at the what's left on the device. So when you have an application running on a device, there's artifacts that are left behind. There's databases, SQLite databases. There's log files. There's other configuration files. So how do we get to those, and what sort of things can we find in them? We do go through essentially the OWASP top 10 as they're applied within mobile pen testing. So several of those do apply to the front end, but a lot of them are also in relation to the back end, like we mentioned earlier. So if we're looking for SQL injection, cross-site scripting, the typical flaws that you're going to find on a web application, we'll also be looking for those on the back end of mobile apps as well. And then we have a scavenger hunt. Sort of a capture the flag type of experience where you can practice what's been taught in a interactive, somewhat realistic environment. So it at least gives you a chance to reuse the tools and practice them, so you learn them better. So if that's something that you're interested in, we do have a class. And we actually have a training week that we're doing in Austin. If you go to securideas.com/classes, you'll be able to find more details on that training week. And that's scheduled for October, so it's still a little ways away. The great thing also about that is like I said, it's a week long. It's actually 4 days of training. This class is only 2 days, so there are other classes that you can take the other 2 days if you're interested in taking a variety of different things. We also have at least one full 4-day class as well in that, and I'll tell you right now that the pricing for that is extremely reasonable. It's you're getting quality training at a rate that's substantially less than what you'll get if you get similar training at one of those large cons. So so it's definitely worth looking into if that's something that's on your list for this year. We also have some other webcast topics coming up. We're doing a Python primer or primer, and that's for kind of getting you started with Python, and that kind of leads into a Python training class as well. We're also doing a PCI for small business, something to getting started with Metasploit. I think we have one that has to do with called Beyond Shell coming up as well. So we have we're trying to do more and more of these webcasts to kind of reach out more to the community and give back. So you'll see more of these. Please, if you're not already on our Twitter feed, that's probably the quickest way to hear about them. But also go on our website, register for a newsletter. We'll be putting them out there as well. So. And that's it. So I'll put my information up there and then address any other questions that come up. So again, I'm Jason Gillam. I'm on Twitter. And my email address is wide open. If you have questions about any of this stuff, I really enjoy what I do and I like talking about. This is Mobisec is kind of a side project for me. We teach it as well, but just keeping up the environment and everything is something that's a bit of a hobby on the side. So. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask them. And let's see. Question on certificate pinning. This is very common with Android apps, and developers feel that it is safe. Do we have any utilities for attacking or breaking certificate pinning? I don't think we have anything specifically on Mobisec for breaking certificate pinning, but that is a good point. Just like a lot of controls, certificate pinning is somewhat of a speed bump. There are ways we can potentially manipulate the environment around the application, or even in some cases modify the application to bypass the pinning mechanism. So it really depends on how well it's implemented, whether or not it's going to work, and also whether or not we can find a way around it. So a lot of controls. This is why we have the defense in depth tenet, right? We want to have several layers of controls. Don't ever rely on just one. And certificate pinning is a good control to put in place, but we don't want to trust that it's always 100% effective. Any other questions? Okay, yeah, and I just scrolled up and saw that there was another question similar. SSL pinning. So it's one thing to check for. What I'll do is if we are testing an application that does manage sensitive data or sensitive functionality and it doesn't have certificate pinning, then what I'll do is actually put that as a finding in a report that certificate pinning is not in place for something. So, all right. Okay. Oh, looks like another question. Before I get to that, though, this is recorded. I hope everything worked properly on the recording. I'll definitely get that together and we'll push that out hopefully today or tomorrow and make that available to everyone. So the other question that I received is any plans on offering any courses online? That is something that we're working on. We're looking at doing breaking some of our courses into series. So we don't want to get online necessarily and talk for 2 days straight, but maybe breaking things up into 2-hour segments or something along those lines makes sense. So the answer, I guess, is yes. It's in the works. We don't have anything finalized yet on that, though. All right, great. Okay, thanks everyone for joining. And I'll close out the session now. If you have any other questions that you didn't get to or that I didn't get to answer, please feel free to email them to me, and I will attempt to answer them to the best of my ability that way. All right. Thanks a lot.